Imagine a world where gold is worthless, where war is despised, where every citizen has meaningful work, where no one goes hungry, and where the pursuit of knowledge is the highest calling. Sounds impossible, right? But in 1516, a brilliant lawyer and philosopher named Thomas More dared to dream of such a place, and he called it Utopia. This isn't just another boring political treatise gathering dust on a shelf. This is a revolutionary vision that challenged everything people believed about power, wealth, and human nature itself. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about how society should work. Thomas More wrote Utopia during a time of tremendous upheaval in Europe. Kings were consolidating power, the Church was facing criticism that would soon explode into the Protestant Reformation, exploration was revealing new worlds across the oceans, and the gap between rich and poor was growing wider every day. More himself was no armchair philosopher. He was a successful lawyer, a member of Parliament, a trusted advisor to King Henry VIII, and a man who would eventually be executed for refusing to compromise his principles. When he sat down to write Utopia, he brought all of this experience, all of this observation, all of this wisdom to bear on one fundamental question: how should human beings live together? The book begins not in Utopia itself, but in Antwerp, where More meets a fascinating traveler named Raphael Hythloday. Now, Raphael is no ordinary wanderer. He's a Portuguese philosopher who sailed with Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer whose name would eventually grace 2 continents. But while Vespucci returned home, Raphael continued exploring, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how different peoples organized their societies. And what he discovered on an island called Utopia changed his entire understanding of what civilization could be. Before Raphael describes Utopia, though, he and More engage in a lengthy conversation about the problems plaguing Europe. And here's where More's genius really shines, because he doesn't just present us with a fantasy world, he first forces us to confront the harsh realities of our own. Raphael talks about the devastating practice of enclosure in England, where wealthy landowners were fencing off common lands to raise sheep for the profitable wool trade, displacing thousands of farmers who had worked that land for generations. These displaced people became beggars, vagrants, and often criminals, simply because they had no way to feed themselves. And what was the government's solution? Hanging them for theft. Raphael points out the absurdity of this. How can you execute people for stealing when you've taken away their ability to make an honest living? The conversation turns to warfare, and Raphael describes how European nations are constantly inventing new justifications for war, twisting old treaties and ancient claims to rationalize conquest and bloodshed. Kings surround themselves with advisors who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. The whole system, Raphael argues, is built on pride, greed, and the endless pursuit of wealth and glory, with no regard for the suffering of ordinary people. More himself plays devil's advocate in this conversation, asking Raphael why he doesn't enter royal service and use his wisdom to counsel kings and improve their policies. But Raphael responds with a devastating critique. In the courts of Europe, any advisor who speaks uncomfortable truths will either be ignored or dismissed. The system isn't interested in genuine reform, it's interested in maintaining the power and privilege of those at the top. Real change, Raphael insists, requires not just better policies, but an entirely different foundation, a complete reimagining of how society itself is structured. And that brings us, finally, to Utopia itself. Picture an island about 200 miles across, crescent-shaped like a new moon, with a narrow entrance to a large bay that provides a magnificent natural harbor. The capital city, Amoret, sits on the banks of a river, with beautiful bridges connecting its 2 halves. The architecture is practical and clean, with houses built 3 stories high, arranged in orderly streets. Every 10 years, citizens exchange houses by lot, ensuring that no one becomes too attached to property or develops a sense of superiority based on where they live. The buildings are well maintained, not because of individual pride of ownership, but because of collective responsibility to the community. The island contains 54 cities, all built on the same plan, all speaking the same language, all following the same laws and customs. Each city is surrounded by agricultural land, and no city is so large that a person cannot walk from the center to the countryside in less than a day. This connection between urban and rural life is fundamental to the utopian vision. People need to understand where their food comes from. They need to maintain contact with the earth and the seasons. Now here's where things get really interesting. In utopia, every person learns agriculture. Every single person, regardless of their other talents or interests, spends 2 years working on the farms. This isn't punishment, it's education. It ensures that everyone understands the fundamental labor that sustains human life, that no one looks down on farmers as inferior, and that the society never lacks people who know how to grow food. After their agricultural service, people return to the cities, but they rotate back to the farms periodically throughout their lives. Beyond agriculture, every utopian learns a trade. The trades are essential crafts: carpentry, metalworking, masonry, weaving. These aren't arbitrary career paths chosen for prestige or profit, they're the skills that keep society functioning. Most people follow the trade of their parents, because children naturally learn by watching and helping. But if someone has a passion for a different trade, they're adopted into a family that practices that craft. And here's a crucial detail: the point isn't to become wealthy or famous in your trade, the point is to contribute to the common good while developing your abilities. The utopians have an incredibly efficient system when it comes to work. Because everyone contributes, because there are no idle rich living off the labor of others, because there are no servants or people employed in luxury trades that serve no real purpose, the amount each person needs to work is minimal. 6 hours a day. That's it. 6 hours of productive labor, and the society has everything it needs. Compare that to Moore's England, where poor people worked from dawn to dusk, or to our own time, where many people struggle with multiple jobs just to make ends meet. The utopians have solved this problem by eliminating waste, inequality, and the production of unnecessary luxuries. So what do people do with all that free time? This is where utopia becomes truly inspiring. They pursue learning. They attend public lectures on literature, philosophy, science, and the arts. The lecture halls are packed with people hungry to improve their minds, to understand the world more deeply, to engage with ideas. Some people use the time for their hobbies, cultivating gardens, practicing music, or refining their crafts beyond the basic requirements. Others simply spend time with family and friends, building relationships and strengthening community bonds. The point is that life isn't consumed by drudgery and survival, there's space for people to become more fully human. The utopians eat together in communal dining halls. This is another revolutionary feature of their society. While people could prepare food at home if they chose, almost everyone prefers the dining halls, where meals are prepared by skilled cooks and where the whole community gathers. The oldest citizens sit in places of honor, but not separated from the young. Rather, the seating alternates old and young so that wisdom can be shared across generations. Meals begin with a reading that's uplifting and brief, then conversation flows freely. The young are encouraged to speak and share their ideas, while the old guide the discussion with their experience. This isn't just about feeding bodies, it's about nourishing minds and spirits, about building community through shared experience. The care the utopians show for these meals extends to their hospitals, which are so well equipped and well staffed that anyone who falls ill actually prefers to be treated there rather than at home. The hospitals are spacious, clean, filled with everything needed for recovery. The sick receive the best food, the most careful attention, the most advanced treatments available. And here's what's remarkable: no one is excluded from this care based on wealth or status, because in utopia, there is no wealth or status in the way we understand it. Which brings us to perhaps the most radical feature of utopian society: they have abolished private property. Completely. There is no money, no personal accumulation of goods, no inheritance, no economic competition. Instead, there are public warehouses where goods are stored, and people simply take what they need. If you need a new coat, you go to the warehouse and get one. If you need tools, you take them. The idea of hoarding or taking more than you need is considered absurd, even shameful. Why would you take more than you need when you know you can always get more whenever you want it? This system works because of two fundamental changes in human behavior. First, scarcity has been eliminated. Because everyone works and contributes, because production is organized rationally for use rather than profit, there's always enough of everything. Second, and this is crucial, the utopians have cultivated values that prioritize community over individual accumulation. They've been raised to find pleasure in learning, in relationships, in contributing to society, rather than in possessing things. They look at gold and silver not as precious metals to be hoarded, but as materials to be used. They make chamber pots out of gold to teach their children that these metals have no intrinsic value beyond what society assigns them. Think about how radical this is. In More's time, as in our own, nearly every social problem can be traced back to economic inequality and the competition for resources. Crime, corruption, war, family breakdown, environmental destruction, all of these stem from people and nations fighting over wealth. The utopians have eliminated the root cause by eliminating private property itself. And far from creating a drab, uniform society where everyone is equally miserable, this has freed people to pursue genuine happiness. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds too good to be true, and you'd be right to be skeptical. More himself, through the character of Raphael, acknowledges potential objections. Won't people be lazy if they don't have the incentive of personal gain? The utopians answer this by creating a society where work is meaningful, where everyone sees the direct results of their labor benefiting their community, where laziness is gently corrected by social pressure rather than punishment. Won't some people take advantage of the system, taking more than they need? Possibly, but the utopians have found that when people are secure in the knowledge that their needs will always be met, the desire to hoard simply fades away. Won't talented people feel stifled if they can't rise above others? The utopians respond that true fulfillment comes not from dominating others but from developing your own capacities and contributing to something larger than yourself. The utopian system of government reflects these same egalitarian principles. Every 30 households elect a magistrate called a suffragant. Every 10 suffragants elect a higher magistrate called a tranibor. And the tranibors elect a prince, who serves for life unless suspected of tyranny. All major decisions are debated thoroughly, with time built in for deliberation so that no one makes hasty choices they'll regret. The prince and tranibors meet regularly to discuss issues affecting the whole island, but they never decide important matters without consulting the suffragants, who in turn consult with the households they represent. This is genuine participatory democracy, where every voice has the potential to be heard, where leaders are accountable to the people, where power flows upward from the citizens rather than downward from a monarch. The utopians have interesting laws regarding governance. Any discussion of public affairs outside the proper constitutional channels, any private meeting to discuss changing the government is punishable by death. This might sound harsh or even hypocritical in a supposedly perfect society, but the reasoning is clear: they want to prevent both conspiracy and demagoguery. All political discussion must be open, transparent, conducted through proper channels where everyone can participate. This prevents powerful individuals from manipulating public opinion or plotting coups. It ensures that change, when it comes, reflects genuine popular will rather than the ambitions of a few. In terms of family structure, the utopians maintain traditional households headed by the oldest male, with wives subordinate to husbands and children to parents. This is one area where More, writing in the 16th century, doesn't challenge the patriarchal assumptions of his time. However, even here there are interesting progressive elements. Women receive the same education as men, they learn trades and participate in civic life. While they're generally assigned lighter work, this is based on physical considerations rather than assumptions about intellectual capacity. And in marriage, both parties must consent, a radical idea in More's time when marriages were often arranged without regard for the feelings of those involved. The utopians approach marriage with characteristic practicality. Before marrying, the couple views each other naked, with a responsible chaperone present. This might seem strange to us, but the logic is sound. You wouldn't buy a horse without examining it carefully, so why would you commit to sharing your life with someone without understanding what you're getting? This custom is designed to prevent disappointment and resentment that could undermine the marriage. Divorce is permitted, but only in cases of adultery or intolerable behavior, and only with the approval of the Senate after careful investigation. The utopians take marriage seriously because they understand it is the foundation of social stability. Education in utopia is lifelong and universal. Children begin formal learning early, and it continues throughout their lives. The language is rich in vocabulary but simple in grammar, making it easy to learn. Music is taught to everyone, and while it differs from European music, it's described as sweet and expressive. The sciences are advanced, particularly astronomy and mathematics, which the utopians study with great sophistication. They've independently discovered many principles that Europeans learned from Greek and Roman texts. In logic and ethics, they excel, debating the nature of happiness, the soul, and the good life with subtlety and insight. The utopian philosophy of pleasure is particularly fascinating. They're not austere ascetics who deny all bodily pleasures, nor are they hedonists who indulge every appetite. Instead, they have a sophisticated understanding of what truly brings happiness. They believe that pleasure is the end goal of human life, but they define pleasure carefully. True pleasure isn't found in momentary sensory gratification that leads to later pain or regret. True pleasure is found in health, in the joy of learning, in peaceful contemplation, in the satisfaction of conscience, in the deep contentment that comes from living virtuously and wisely. They categorize pleasures into those of the body and those of the mind, but they consider mental pleasures superior. The pleasure of understanding, of solving a problem, of creating something beautiful, of helping others, these bring deeper and more lasting satisfaction than food, drink, or sexual gratification. This doesn't mean they reject bodily pleasures. They enjoy good food and drink, comfortable clothing, and sexual intimacy within marriage. But they never allow these to dominate their lives or cause harm to themselves or others. The utopians are religious, but their religion is remarkably diverse and tolerant. Different people hold different beliefs about the nature of God and the afterlife, but they all agree on certain fundamental principles: that the world was created by a divine power, that this power governs all things with providence, that the soul is immortal, and that after death we receive rewards or punishments based on how we lived. Beyond these basics, people are free to believe as their conscience dictates. This religious tolerance is enshrined in law. King Utopus, the founder of utopian civilization, decreed that everyone should be free to practice their own religion and to persuade others through gentle reason, but no one should use force, insults, or violence to spread their faith. Anyone who causes conflict or discord in the name of religion is exiled or enslaved. This policy arose from Utopus's observation that religious conflict had torn apart many societies, and from his wisdom in recognizing that truth is best discovered through free inquiry rather than coercion. The utopians have priests, but only a small number, 13 per city, elected by the people in a secret ballot. These priests are extraordinarily virtuous individuals, deeply learned and genuinely pious. They're responsible for education of the young, for conducting religious services, and for providing moral guidance to the community. Interestingly, women can become priests, though female priests are always elderly widows while male priests can be younger. The priests have the power to excommunicate someone who has committed serious moral offenses, and this excommunication is dreaded because it means public disgrace and exclusion from religious services until the person has reformed. Religious services in Utopia are designed to be inclusive of all beliefs. The temples are beautiful but austere, dimly lit to encourage contemplation. The services include hymns, prayers, and periods of silent reflection where each person communes with the divine according to their own understanding. The language is carefully chosen to be acceptable to all the different sects, mentioning God in general terms rather than using specific theological formulations that might offend some believers. After the service, people prostrate themselves before God, acknowledging their dependence on divine providence and asking for strength to live virtuously. The utopians believe that God wants us to be happy, and that the path to happiness is virtue. They see no contradiction between religion and pleasure, properly understood, because they believe God created us with desires and capacities for enjoyment. The key is to pursue pleasures that are genuine and lasting rather than false and fleeting, and to never harm ourselves or others in the pursuit of happiness. This is a religion of joy and gratitude rather than guilt and fear, though they do believe in divine judgment and the importance of living righteously. When it comes to warfare, the utopians are pacifists by preference but realists by necessity. They hate war, considering it an activity fit for beasts rather than humans. They're amazed that Europeans glorify military conquest and honor those who excel at killing. However, both men and women receive military training so they can defend themselves if attacked. They will go to war for only a few reasons: to defend their own territory, to defend their allies, to liberate people suffering under tyranny, or to obtain colonies for their surplus population if their own island becomes overcrowded and if the land they're settling is not being used by its current inhabitants. When they do fight, the utopians fight intelligently. They use their wealth to hire mercenaries from warlike nations, particularly a people called the Zapolites who love fighting and have no moral qualms about switching sides for money. The utopians send these mercenaries into the most dangerous situations, knowing that if they're killed, the world is better off without such violent people. They also use psychological warfare, offering large rewards for the assassination or capture of enemy leaders, trying to end wars quickly and with minimal bloodshed. They consider it a greater victory to win through strategy and diplomacy than through carnage on the battlefield. In battle, the utopians protect their women, who fight alongside men, and each family fights together so they'll support and encourage each other. They never kill or capture more people than necessary. They don't destroy crops or burn villages. They treat prisoners humanely and enslave only those who have been truly unjust. After victory, they don't burden their allies with the costs of the war, instead drawing payment from the defeated nation, either in money that they add to their treasury for future emergencies or in land that they can colonize. The goal is always to restore peace as quickly as possible and to create conditions where the conflict won't recur. The utopians have a fascinating relationship with foreign nations. They make few treaties because they observe that in Europe, treaties are constantly broken and reinterpreted to suit the powerful. Instead, they believe that nature itself creates a bond between all humans, that we should treat each other with kindness regardless of written agreements. If treaties are constantly violated, they reason, then human nature is a better foundation for peace than pieces of paper. They will honor alliances with nations that request their protection, and they're fierce in defending their allies, but they prefer to live in peace and focus on improving their own society. Trade with other nations is minimal because the utopians have everything they need. They export their surplus production, but they don't seek profit, often giving goods away to poorer nations. They import very little, mostly iron which they don't have in sufficient quantities on their island, though they're skilled metalworkers. The lack of commerce with other nations helps preserve their unique culture and prevents the corruption that they see wealth and luxury causing in other societies. Now, let's talk about slavery, which exists in Utopia but in a form quite different from what existed in More's world or in the ancient world. Utopian slaves are not captives from foreign wars sold on auction blocks. They're either criminals who have committed serious offenses in Utopia itself, or people from other nations who have been sentenced to death and whom the Utopians have purchased and brought to their island. In Utopia, these people do the unpleasant work that would otherwise fall to free citizens, like slaughtering animals. The condition of slavery isn't necessarily permanent. Slaves who show genuine reform can be freed, while those who remain rebellious or dangerous are eventually executed. This system reflects More's belief that punishment should serve reformation rather than mere retribution, but it also shows the limitations of his 16th-century imagination in conceiving of alternatives to forced labor. The Utopians are passionate about learning from other cultures. When Raphael's party arrived on their shores, the Utopians were intensely curious about everything they could teach. They learned Greek from Raphael and his companions with incredible speed, mastering in months what would take others years. They absorbed the works of Plato, Aristotle, the Greek historians, and medical texts with voracious appetite. They particularly loved the practical knowledge they gained. The Greek medical texts helped them improve their already excellent healthcare, and they quickly developed the technology to make paper and print books, multiplying the availability of knowledge throughout their society. This openness to learning is one of the Utopians' greatest strengths. They don't assume they have everything figured out, they're constantly looking for ways to improve. When they find a good idea, they adopt it enthusiastically. When they discover they've been mistaken about something, they change course without pride or stubbornness. This intellectual humility, combined with their rational organization of society, allows them to progress continually toward greater wisdom and happiness. The Utopians' attitude toward their own society is not one of smug perfection but of thoughtful contentment. They recognize that they've solved problems that plague other nations, they've eliminated poverty, crime is rare, everyone has meaningful work and abundant leisure, learning flourishes, and people genuinely care for each other. They're not naive about human nature, they know people can be selfish and short-sighted, which is why their laws and customs are designed to channel human impulses in positive directions. But they've proven that with the right social structures, humans can create communities of remarkable harmony and flourishing. More ends the book with a return to the conversation between himself and Raphael. After hearing this lengthy description of Utopia, More admits that there are many features of utopian society he finds admirable and wishes could be adopted in Europe, though he doubts they ever will be. The elimination of private property, in particular, strikes him as both the foundation of utopian success and the most impossible to implement elsewhere. People are too attached to ownership, too convinced that private property is necessary for prosperity and freedom. But here's the brilliant ambiguity of More's text. We're never entirely sure how much he agrees with Raphael's enthusiasm for utopia and how much he's maintaining critical distance. More the character expresses doubts, but more the author has given us a vision detailed and attractive enough that we can't simply dismiss it. He's forcing us to think, to question our assumptions, to imagine alternatives to the way things are. This is the power of utopian thinking, not that it provides a perfect blueprint to be implemented exactly, but that it expands our sense of what's possible and challenges us to improve the societies we actually inhabit. The word, utopia, itself embodies this ambiguity. In Greek, it's a pun, it can mean, good place, or, no place, suggesting both an ideal to strive toward and an admission that perfection may be unattainable. More knew this. He was too sophisticated a thinker to believe he'd designed a flawless society. What he was doing was holding up a mirror to European civilization and showing how monstrous it looked, how cruel, how irrational, how wasteful of human potential. If we could create utopia, he was asking, why do we instead create societies where some live in absurd luxury while others starve, where the talented are held back by accident of birth, where we squander human lives in pointless wars, where we punish the desperate for trying to survive? The influence of utopia on subsequent thought has been profound. The word itself entered our language. We now speak of utopian visions, utopian schemes, utopian thinking. The book inspired countless later attempts to imagine perfect societies, from science fiction novels to actual experimental communities. It gave people permission to think radically, to question whether things have to be the way they are. Every social reform movement, every attempt to create a more just and equitable society, owes something to More's daring vision. But utopia also influenced dystopian literature, those dark visions of societies gone wrong. Writers like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell took elements of utopian thinking, particularly the emphasis on social control and the elimination of individual desires, and showed how these could lead to nightmare societies. This critical tradition is valuable too. It reminds us that the road to hell can be paved with utopian intentions, that we need to protect individual freedom even as we pursue collective flourishing. The tension between individual liberty and social harmony is one that every society must navigate, and there are no easy answers. What makes More's utopia particularly powerful is that it emerges from lived experience rather than abstract theorizing. More knew politics intimately. He understood how power corrupts, how difficult it is to give good counsel to those who don't want to hear it, how systems perpetuate themselves through inertia and vested interests. He'd seen poverty and injustice firsthand. He'd represented clients in court. He'd walked the streets where beggars died of cold and hunger. His utopian vision wasn't escapism, it was a challenge, a demand that society could and should do better. More's own life adds poignancy to his utopian vision. He wrote utopia as a successful man climbing the ladder of power and prestige in Tudor England. But he would eventually face an impossible choice: compromise his conscience by accepting Henry VIII's break with Rome and his claim to be head of the Church in England, or refuse and face execution. More chose conscience. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, separated from his beloved family, and eventually beheaded for treason. His final words were reportedly, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." There's a profound connection between More's utopian thinking and his martyrdom. In Utopia, he imagined a society governed by reason and virtue rather than by arbitrary power and self-interest. He showed how much better life could be if we prioritized the common good over individual accumulation, if we valued wisdom over wealth, if we built our institutions to serve human flourishing rather than to concentrate power. But he also understood that those who benefit from the existing system will fight to preserve it, that speaking truth to power is dangerous, that there are limits to how much change the powerful will tolerate. More's willingness to die for his principles rather than betray them shows that he lived by the values he celebrated in Utopia. The Utopians, remember, value conscience above everything. They believe the soul is immortal and that we'll be judged by how we lived. More believed this too, and when tested, he proved he meant it. His death was a kind of triumph, not of political power but of moral integrity, and in this sense he embodied the utopian ideal even as he lived in a profoundly un-utopian world. Reading Utopia today, we can see both how much has changed and how much remains the same. We've made progress on some fronts. Many societies now have public education, healthcare systems, social safety nets, protections for workers, all things that would have seemed utopian in More's time. Democracy has spread, though imperfectly, and many people now have a voice in how they're governed. Religious tolerance, while far from universal, is at least recognized as an ideal in many places. But we've also failed to achieve the most radical aspects of More's vision. Private property remains the foundation of our economic system. Inequality has grown to obscene levels in many countries. We still have poverty amidst plenty. We still wage wars. We still structure our societies in ways that benefit the few at the expense of the many. The fundamental question Utopia poses remains unanswered. Can we create societies that genuinely prioritize human well-being over profit, that value cooperation over competition, that measure success by how well we care for each other rather than by how much wealth we accumulate? The environmental crisis adds urgency to this question. The utopians lived in harmony with nature, taking only what they needed, producing no waste, viewing the earth as something to be stewarded rather than exploited. Our current system, by contrast, treats nature as an infinite resource to be consumed in a limitless sink for our waste. We're discovering, far too late, that this is suicidal. Perhaps we need to revisit More's vision of a society that lives within its means, that defines prosperity not by endless growth but by sustainable sufficiency, that measures wealth in health, learning, and relationships rather than in money and possessions. The utopian emphasis on meaningful work also speaks to our moment. Many people today feel their work is pointless, that they're spending their lives enriching others while struggling to survive themselves, that the work available to them doesn't utilize their talents or contribute to anything worthwhile. The utopians solved this by ensuring everyone did necessary work and by reducing the working day to 6 hours so people had time for what really matters. With modern technology, we could arguably work even less than 6 hours and still produce abundance. Why don't we? Because our system is designed to maximize profit rather than human flourishing, because we've been taught that our worth comes from productivity rather than from our inherent humanity. The utopian approach to education offers another crucial lesson. In their society, learning isn't a commodity you purchase or a credential you acquire to get a better job, it's a lifelong joy freely available to all. Imagine if we truly prioritized education this way, if we made libraries and universities and cultural institutions genuinely accessible, if we gave people the time to pursue learning throughout their lives, if we celebrated intellectual curiosity and creativity the way we celebrate wealth and fame. How much human potential would we unleash? How many problems might we solve? More's vision of communal meals and shared spaces challenges our modern isolation. We increasingly live in our separate homes, eat our separate meals, entertain ourselves with our separate screens, and wonder why we feel lonely and disconnected. The utopians understood that humans are social creatures who need community, face-to-face interaction, shared rituals and experiences. Their dining halls weren't just about efficient food distribution, they were about building and maintaining the bonds that hold society together. Perhaps we need to rediscover the value of common spaces and collective activities, of knowing our neighbors, of building communities rooted in place rather than in digital networks. The utopian practice of religious tolerance might be their most relevant gift to our divided world. They insisted that people with different beliefs must live together peacefully, must persuade rather than coerce, must find common ground while respecting differences. They didn't achieve this through relativism or indifference. The utopians held their beliefs passionately, but through the recognition that forcing someone to change their convictions creates only hypocrisy and resentment, never genuine conversion. In our age of religious and political polarization, this lesson is desperately needed. What would Moore make of our world today? He'd likely marvel at our technology, the ability to communicate instantly across vast distances, to access information on any topic, to cure diseases that were death sentences in his time, to travel across the world in hours. But he might also despair at how we've used these powers. We have the technological capacity to eliminate poverty, yet billions live in destitution. We can communicate globally, yet seem increasingly unable to understand each other. We have access to infinite information, yet seem no wiser than our ancestors. The failure isn't technological, it's social and moral. We've mastered the physical world while remaining enslaved to greed, pride, and short-sighted self-interest. We've created global markets but not global community, we've connected our economies but not our hearts. This is precisely what Moore was warning against, the danger of pursuing wealth and power rather than wisdom and virtue, of building our civilization on foundations of selfishness rather than solidarity. But here's the hopeful message at the heart of utopia: we have a choice. There's nothing inevitable about inequality, poverty, or social dysfunction. These are the results of human decisions, of the institutions and values we've chosen to create. And what we've chosen to create, we can choose to change. The utopians aren't a different species with different natures, they're humans who organized their society differently and thereby enabled different behaviors and achieved different outcomes. We could do the same. This doesn't mean we should try to implement Moore's utopia exactly as described, that would be foolish and impossible. The details of utopian society reflect Moore's 16th century context, his assumptions about family and gender, his Christian worldview, the economic conditions of his time. A modern utopia would look different, would need to grapple with questions of technology, diversity, environmental sustainability, individual freedom in ways Moore never imagined. But the fundamental principles remain valid. Organize society for the benefit of all rather than the few, ensure everyone can meet their basic needs, give people time for learning and relationships, make decisions collectively and transparently, value what truly matters rather than what merely appears valuable. The genius of utopia is that it makes us question our assumptions about what's possible and necessary. We assume private property is essential for prosperity, but the utopians thrive without it. We assume people need the threat of poverty to motivate them, but the utopians work cheerfully out of civic duty and the joy of contribution. We assume inequality is inevitable, but the utopians have eliminated it. We assume war is part of human nature, but the utopians fight only when absolutely necessary and always seek peace. By showing us these alternatives, Moore frees our imagination to conceive of better possibilities. Throughout history, people have dismissed utopian thinking as naive, impractical, even dangerous. They've insisted that you can't change human nature, that inequality is natural, that scarcity is inevitable, that the way things are is the way things must be. But this is counsel of despair, and it's been proven wrong repeatedly. Slavery was once considered natural and necessary, now it's universally condemned. Women were once considered intellectually inferior and unfit for public life, now they lead nations and excel in every field. Ideas that seemed impossibly utopian in one generation become common sense in the next. This is the ultimate lesson of utopia: change is possible. Better worlds are possible. We don't have to accept poverty, injustice, and unnecessary suffering as inevitable features of human existence. We can imagine alternatives, we can debate and refine them, we can experiment and learn, we can build institutions that serve human flourishing rather than human exploitation. It won't be easy, it will require courage to challenge entrenched power and conventional wisdom, it will require patience to build something new, it will require wisdom to avoid the mistakes of the past while pursuing the possibilities of the future. More's book is ultimately an act of faith in human potential. He believed that we're capable of living together in harmony, of organizing our affairs rationally, of prioritizing long-term flourishing over short-term gratification, of extending compassion beyond our immediate circle to include all humanity. He believed that reason and virtue could triumph over greed and violence, that knowledge could overcome ignorance, that we could build societies worthy of our highest aspirations. And he believed all this despite living in a world of war, corruption, and cruelty, despite seeing daily evidence of human selfishness and short-sightedness. That faith in human potential is what makes Utopia not just a political treatise but a profoundly motivational text. More is telling us that we're better than we think we are, that we're capable of more than we've achieved, that the misery and injustice we see around us aren't reflections of fixed human nature but of flawed human choices. And if they're the result of choices, then different choices can produce different results. We're not trapped, we're not helpless, we're not doomed to repeat the failures of the past. We have agency, we have intelligence, we have the capacity for moral growth. The question is whether we'll use these gifts wisely. Consider how the utopians approach problem solving. When they encounter a challenge, they don't throw up their hands and declare it unsolvable, they don't blame it on human nature or divine will. They analyze it rationally and look for practical solutions. Crime rates too high? Don't just build more prisons, examine why people are committing crimes and address the root causes. People not getting enough food? Don't just give them charity, reorganize production and distribution so everyone has access to what they need. Social conflict and resentment? Don't just crack down on dissent. Create institutions that give everyone a stake in society and a voice in decisions. This pragmatic, problem-solving approach combined with moral imagination is what we desperately need today. We face challenges that More couldn't have conceived: climate change threatening the habitability of our planet, artificial intelligence potentially transforming the nature of work and consciousness, weapons capable of destroying civilization, technologies that can enhance human capabilities but also enable unprecedented surveillance and control. We need utopian thinking not as escapism but as a tool for navigating these challenges, for imagining futures worth striving toward rather than merely reacting to threats. What would a modern utopia look like? It might have renewable energy powering clean cities where people live in community rather than isolation. It might have universal basic income ensuring everyone can meet their needs while pursuing meaningful work and creative endeavors. It might have participatory democracy enhanced by technology that makes it easier for citizens to engage in collective decision-making. It might have education systems that nurture curiosity and creativity rather than merely training workers. It might have health care that treats wellness as a right rather than a commodity. It might have restorative justice that heals harm rather than merely punishing offenders. None of these ideas is as radical as the complete abolition of private property that More proposed, yet all of them face fierce resistance from those invested in the status quo. This reveals something important. The obstacles to creating better societies aren't primarily technical or economic, they're political and ideological. We have the resources and knowledge to eliminate poverty, to provide education and healthcare to all, to transition to sustainable energy, to create meaningful work for everyone. What we lack is the collective will, the shared vision, the courage to challenge powerful interests and demand transformation. This is where More's example becomes most inspiring. He knew the risks of challenging power. He understood that speaking truth could cost him everything, yet he spoke anyway. He wrote Utopia knowing it would be controversial, knowing it challenged the foundations of the social order he was part of, knowing it could be seen as seditious or heretical. And later, when tested even more severely, when asked to choose between life and conscience, he chose conscience. He showed that some things matter more than survival, that integrity and truth are worth dying for, that we define ourselves not by our circumstances but by our choices. Now, you might be thinking, that's a rather extreme example. I'm not being asked to die for my beliefs. And that's true, most of us will never face such stark choices. But we all face smaller versions of the same question every day. Will we go along with injustice because it's easier, or will we speak up even when it's uncomfortable? Will we pursue wealth and status through exploitation, or will we insist on earning our living ethically? Will we ignore suffering we could alleviate because it doesn't affect us directly, or will we extend ourselves for others? Will we accept things as they are, or will we work for things as they should be? These daily choices matter. They accumulate over time, they shape who we become, they influence the people around us, they contribute to the culture and institutions that structure our collective life. Every time someone chooses integrity over expedience, compassion over indifference, justice over self-interest, they're making the world slightly more like utopia and slightly less like the corrupt, cruel societies More was criticizing. Every time someone imagines a better way and works to implement it, they're engaging in utopian thinking in the best sense. More understood that transformation begins in the imagination. Before you can change the world, you have to envision alternatives to how it currently works. This is why authoritarian regimes always try to crush utopian thinking, why they insist there is no alternative to the existing system, why they punish anyone who dares to dream of something better. They understand that imagination is dangerous, that once people glimpse the possibility of a better world, they become dissatisfied with the present world, they start asking uncomfortable questions, they start organizing to demand change. This is the subversive power of utopia. More isn't just describing an imaginary island, he's planting seeds of discontent with the world as it is, he's awakening moral imagination, he's showing that the emperor has no clothes, that the institutions we're told are natural and necessary are actually contingent and changeable. He's inviting us to think critically about everything we've been taught to accept without question. Why should some people own land while others have none? Why should monarchs inherit power rather than earning it? Why should the poor be punished for poverty? Why should nations squander their youth in wars? Why should any of this be considered normal or acceptable? These questions are as relevant now as they were 500 years ago. Why should health care be a commodity rather than a right? Why should education leave students with crushing debt? Why should workers struggle with multiple jobs while corporate profits soar? Why should we accept homelessness in wealthy societies? Why should democratic governments serve corporate interests over citizen welfare? Why should future generations inherit a degraded planet? Why should any of this be considered normal or acceptable? Asking these questions doesn't make you naive or impractical, it makes you thoughtful and moral. Utopian thinking isn't about being unrealistic, it's about refusing to accept unnecessary suffering as inevitable. It's about insisting that we can do better, that we must do better, that we have both the capacity and the obligation to create societies that enable human flourishing rather than merely enriching the powerful. This isn't idealism in the sense of ignoring reality, it's idealism in the sense of holding reality accountable to our ideals. The utopians themselves weren't passive dreamers waiting for their perfect society to magically materialize. They were active builders who worked to create and maintain their institutions. They educated each new generation in their values, they discussed and debated how to handle new challenges, they were willing to learn from others and adapt their practices. Their society worked because people worked at it, because they took responsibility for the collective good, because they recognized that freedom and flourishing require constant effort and vigilance. This is crucial. Creating better societies isn't about finding the perfect blueprint and implementing it once, it's about committing to ongoing work, to constant improvement, to collective problem solving. It's about building institutions that are responsive to people's needs and accountable to people's voices. It's about cultivating values like compassion, justice, wisdom, and courage in ourselves and others. It's about being willing to experiment, to fail, to learn, and to try again. The utopians weren't perfect, and more knew it, but they were committed to the pursuit of perfection, to always striving to be better. There's a beautiful passage in Utopia where Raphael describes how the utopians handle innovation. If someone proposes an improvement to their laws or customs, it's debated thoroughly, considered from every angle, tested carefully before being adopted widely. They don't cling stubbornly to tradition simply because it's tradition, but neither do they embrace every novelty without reflection. They're conservative in the best sense, preserving what works while remaining open to beneficial change. This balance between stability and adaptability is one of the keys to their success. We could learn from this approach in our own time, where we often swing between reactionary rejection of all change and thoughtless embrace of every new technology or idea. We need the wisdom to distinguish between changes that genuinely improve human life and changes that merely create new problems or enrich the few at the expense of the many. We need institutions that are stable enough to provide security but flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. We need traditions that ground us without imprisoning us. The utopians also understood something crucial about human psychology. People need meaning, purpose, and community to thrive. This is why they organized work to be meaningful rather than just economically productive, why they created rituals and shared experiences that brought people together, why they emphasized learning and moral development, why they built their society around relationships rather than transactions. They recognized that humans aren't just economic units to be exploited for labor, we're complex beings with emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual needs that must be met for us to flourish. Our modern world has forgotten this, or rather, our economic system has systematically ignored it in favor of treating people as resources to be used up and discarded. We see the results in epidemic levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and despair even in materially wealthy societies. People have smartphones and streaming services but lack purpose and connection. They have access to infinite information but struggle to find meaning. They're more connected digitally but more isolated emotionally than perhaps any previous generation. This is the price of organizing society around profit rather than people, around individual consumption rather than community flourishing. More saw this coming 500 years ago. He saw how the emerging market economy was dissolving traditional communities, how the enclosure movement was destroying rural life, how the pursuit of wealth was becoming an end in itself rather than a means to human well-being. He wrote Utopia partly as a warning. This is where we're headed if we don't change course, toward a society where everything is commodified, where human relationships are transactional, where meaning is found only in accumulation, where the rich get richer while the poor are blamed for their poverty. And he offered an alternative vision. We could instead organize society around what actually makes humans happy, around meaningful work and genuine relationships and intellectual growth and moral development. The choice Moore presented remains before us. We can continue down the path of commodification and exploitation, treating people and nature as resources to be consumed, measuring success by GDP growth and stock prices while ignoring human and environmental costs. Or we can change course, can build societies that prioritize well-being over wealth, that measure success by how well we care for the most vulnerable, that recognize we're all in this together and our fates are intertwined. The first path leads to increasing inequality, environmental catastrophe, and social breakdown. The second path leads towards something resembling utopia, not perfect perhaps, but far better than what we have now. Making this choice, both individually and collectively, requires courage. It requires courage to challenge systems that benefit us personally, courage to speak uncomfortable truths, courage to imagine alternatives when everyone around us insists there is no alternative, courage to work for change even when success seems distant or impossible. Moore had this courage, and his example can inspire us to find it in ourselves. He risked his career to write Utopia, and ultimately sacrificed his life rather than compromise his principles. We may not be called to such extreme sacrifice, but we are called to live with integrity, to use whatever power and privilege we have in service of justice, to refuse complicity with systems of exploitation and oppression. One of the most powerful aspects of Utopia is how it reframes success and failure. In conventional terms, Moore's life ended in failure. He was executed as a traitor, his property was confiscated, his family was left in difficult circumstances. But in the terms Utopia itself proposes, his life was an extraordinary success. He lived with integrity, he contributed to human understanding, he spoke truth to power, he chose conscience over convenience, he left a legacy that has inspired millions. The utopians would have honored him as a model citizen, someone who embodied their highest values. This reframing is profoundly liberating. It means we don't have to measure our lives by wealth, status, or power. We can instead measure them by different standards. Did we treat others with kindness? Did we work for justice? Did we develop our capacities? Did we contribute to our communities? Did we leave the world better than we found it? Did we live with integrity? These are the questions that matter. These are the measures of a life well lived, and by these standards, many people who seem unsuccessful by conventional metrics are actually profound successes. The utopians understood this deeply. Their society wasn't organized to produce billionaires or celebrities, it was organized to enable everyone to live well, to develop their potential, to contribute meaningfully, to experience the genuine pleasures of learning, relationships, and virtuous living. Nobody in Utopia was desperately poor, but nobody was obscenely wealthy either. And far from finding this limiting, the Utopians were happier than the Europeans who had vast inequality. They had discovered what research now confirms: beyond a certain point of material sufficiency, additional wealth adds little to happiness, while inequality, insecurity, and lack of purpose create misery even amid abundance. So what's the takeaway from all of this? What should we do with Moore's vision? First, we should allow it to expand our sense of what's possible. The problems we face aren't inevitable, they're the result of choices, and different choices can produce different outcomes. Second, we should let it sharpen our critique of the present. When we see poverty, injustice, or suffering, we should ask not just how to alleviate it temporarily but how to transform the systems that produce it. Third, we should let it inspire our action. We may not be able to create a perfect society, but we can work to make our own corner of the world more just, more compassionate, more humane. Start where you are. Treat people with dignity and kindness. Challenge injustice when you see it, even when it's uncomfortable. Support organizations working for positive change. Vote for leaders committed to the common good. Use whatever talents and resources you have in service of others. Build community with your neighbors. Live simply so others can simply live. Pursue learning not just for career advancement but for the joy of understanding. Cultivate gratitude for what you have rather than envy for what others possess. These may seem like small actions, but they matter. They create ripples that spread outward. They model alternatives to the dominant culture of selfishness and competition. They plant seeds that may flower in ways you'll never see. Thomas More knew he wouldn't live to see utopia realized on Earth. He knew that writing one book wouldn't transform society overnight. But he wrote it anyway because he believed in the power of ideas, because he trusted that truth has a force of its own, because he had faith that humans are capable of creating better worlds. 500 years later, his book still challenges and inspires us. His vision still calls us to something higher. His example still shows that integrity matters more than survival, that some truths are worth dying for, that the pursuit of justice is worth any cost. You've just experienced the revolutionary vision of Utopia, a book that dared to imagine a world without poverty, without greed, without war, a world where every person could flourish and contribute and live with dignity. More's Island may not exist on any map, but his ideals can exist in our hearts and shape our actions. We may never create a perfect society, but we can create better ones. We may never eliminate all suffering, but we can reduce it dramatically. We may never achieve complete justice, but we can move steadily toward it. The journey begins with imagination, continues with courage, and succeeds through persistent effort. If this summary has opened your mind to new possibilities, if it's challenged you to think differently about society and your place in it, if it's inspired you to work for a better world, then please hit that like button and subscribe to Audiobook Gist for more transformative content. Share this with someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that better worlds are waiting to be built, that we're all capable of more than we've been told. Remember, utopia isn't just a place, it's a choice we make every day to believe in human potential and work toward human flourishing. Now go out there and start building your own version of utopia, one decision, one action, one relationship at a time. The future is unwritten, and you hold the pen. Make it count.